Hello and welcome back to our second season of our podcast, Invisible Wound. This limited 5-episode podcast series is part of our larger project called Hakara, Facing Transgenerational Trauma. This project was initiated by AMCHA Germany and funded by the German Foreign Office. AMCHA Germany supports the Israeli NGO AMCHA that was established in 1987 by a group of Holocaust survivors and devoted mental health professionals. AMCHA Israel offers psychosocial support for Holocaust survivors and their families in 15 centers across the country. My name is Sharon Ryba-Kahn. I'm a Berlin-based filmmaker and third generation of survivors of the Shoah. This is the perspective I'll be speaking from. In the first season of this podcast, we focused on the perspective of Aboriginal Australians and their experiences of collective transgenerational trauma. You can listen to the episodes on Spotify and YouTube. For this season, we have chosen a different approach. We will be talking to trauma experts and artists with different perspectives and different experiences of transgenerational, collective, and genocidal violence. What they have in common is their activism and engagement to address the effects of trauma throughout generations and societal boundaries. But now, let's welcome Tayo.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. And also thanks for the opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Tayo Awosusi-Onutor. I am a singer, author, and also political activist, and I'm also a mother. I am part of Roma and Sinti, an initiative of Roma and Sinti women based in Berlin, Germany. And I refer to myself as Afro-Sintezza because I have roots in the Sinti community, but I'm also a Black woman. And my work is actually between different fields of musical work, artistic work, and political activism.
When I say to you collective transgenerational trauma, what comes up in your mind and your heart and your soul?
Well, what actually comes up is the first picture or word is family, history, and also everyday life. Because the transgenerational trauma is part of our family, it's part of our history. And the more I actually think about it, read about it, hear about it, I realize how much it is woven in our everyday life.
When you say it's completely woven into you and the first thing you think about is family, what is exactly the image that you have in your head?
Growing up, I just had different effects of and not only me, I think, but I'm only speaking for myself, but I also know from other people that I talked with, work with, live with, that they had similar experiences. But I think growing up, there were effects of the trauma or a certain behavior, careful behavior that I can see in myself, that I can see in family members. And I think back then when I was growing up, even my parents or grandparents, I think they didn't really realize what the cause was. But now, due to political activism, and my mother's also politically active, I think over the years dealing with these subjects, we just realized more and more through the work how much the trauma has actually affected our families' lives and it still affects our life today. Just to name an example, being really super careful with the children. On the surface, you might just think, okay, it's children, of course they're precious, totally natural to be careful with your children, right? I realize more and more certain things can be a trigger. Random things going to a field trip, for instance. This would cause a lot of discussion in a family home. Is it okay to go there? Where are they going exactly? And all these thoughts, showed me more and more okay, it's not every family worrying the way we worry. And I realized more and more that definitely has to do with the trauma and the fear of loss. And somehow, maybe it's not really spoken out, but somehow there's always this thought of what if it happens again? What if they do it to us again? And I think it's just really something that, that it's passed on to the generations. And of course, it's not always the same. It develops, but it's still there.
I imagine it must be very difficult, especially here in Germany, when you say to someone, I'm the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. Can you share something with us, please?
Yeah, definitely. And I would love to share experiences about it, because I think actually this is also part of the situation that we're facing as Romani and Sinti community. And growing up in Germany, you could always see, experience again and again, also through my work, that actually the history or part of the German history is invisible. And the interesting thing is, like, the racism towards Roma and Sinti is also based on making things invisible. This is why, like, many people have, when we talk about Roma and Sinti in Germany, the knowledge that exists about Roma and Sinti most of the time is racist stereotypes and many, like, really old pictures that root in the Middle Ages. So you have to ask yourself, like, how come a young person today will have these, old racial stereotypes from the 1500s, for instance. So that shows you how powerful this tradition and this cultivation is. And going back to your question, I also do work in seminars where I'm talking about our history, talking about discrimination, talking about, like, who are actually Roma and Sinti and what is the history, and trying to fill the gaps that are actually produced by the German school system, or maybe I could even say a European school system. And if you imagine, I'm working, like, with younger people who just graduated, so they're young, they're coming straight out of school, they should have all the details and info and history about Roma and Sinti, about the National Socialism in Germany, the war, Holocaust. And if you ask them, what have you learned in school about Roma and Sinti when it comes to the Holocaust? And there are like 30 people sitting, for instance. Maybe one person will say, they talked about it in school and said they were also victims. Full stop. That's it. And then here we are trying to fill the gaps, trying to, give them the history. And oftentimes they say stuff like, oh my God, this is the first time I'm actually meeting a Romani woman or a Sinti woman or a person from the community. And I often tell them, I don't think so. You probably met people from our community before, but you just don't know because they don't tell you. Because they know if they do tell, then they are facing a lot of racism, they're facing a lot of prejudice, and of course it's the better choice oftentimes to not say it, especially if you are in an environment where you don't really feel like you can trust. So that's actually the situation. Like, it's made invisible. They just know, like, they've also been victims, but many people today still use the racial term for Roma and Sinti and don't really realize that it's a racial term. Or maybe they do, but they think it's okay to use it because this is what we've been using, like, ever since. And then oftentimes you have situations like, okay, listen, maybe you don't know, this is the racial term. Our real name is Roma and Sinti, and can you please use that? Because if not, you're actually hurting somebody and it's discriminating. And oftentimes, luckily, people are like, oh, okay, I had no idea. So most of the times you have this reaction. But of course, there are also sometimes some situations where people are like, well, I don't really see why I should change it because it's also used maybe in film, in media, it's used in books, it's used in the music, it's used even in food. Almost every German supermarket has like this certain sauce that uses the racial term for Sinti and Roma. So there's still a lot to do. A lot has been done already. And just making our history, making us visible like we do now while we're talking is really, really important.
What other experiences have you had in your work?
Back in the days, I also worked a lot with other women, sisters from Romani Pen. And this was also, of course, supportive because you're with somebody else from your community. That's that's already a great, start. And back then, I think there were oftentimes situations where people in seminars, for instance, would, use the racial term. And of course, it's painful, if you have to deal with that and you explain it and you stay calm and you stay professional. But at the same time, people just want to insist, and some, of course, not all, thank God, but some just want, to insist and start discussing and come up with like really old racist pictures and then you just, have to like discuss with them. And that's really draining. Today, what has changed is that I maybe oftentimes don't do that kind of work at that level anymore. So I might still hold a seminar, but I will make sure like how the environment is, what kind of event is it, what kind of people are gonna be participating. Do they already have some idea of the history? Have they done their homework, so to say? So just to know like what are we dealing with. And then what I and us as a feminist organization, Roma and Sinti, also do a lot is we create a lot of content. And that content that we create, this can be videos, this can be podcasts, this can be handouts people can work with in schools or in any other field, actually. And all this content already fills a lot of gaps. Also making it accessible, putting it online. And and I think, and also in German, in English, and also in Romanes. So people who are willing and who want to know about it, it's there, and they can use it. And
how was trauma concretely addressed in your family? How do you remember it specifically? Are there images? I mean, how was the past present in you growing up?
I think it was just always there, even though nobody really like talked about it directly. But it was always there. There was always like a certain kind of like fear, like being careful. And as a child, you just know that I won't be allowed to do this or that, what maybe one of my friends is doing or something. You just knew where the borders are, where the boundaries are somehow, without it being explained. Oh, listen, your grandparents had to go through this, and they fortunately survived, and here we are, and this is why you are not allowed to take your bike and ride with your friends because that's too far from the house, for instance. So nobody said it like that. It was just like, no, that's dangerous. We don't do that. That's it. So you just knew like, this is what I can do. This is what I can't do. So it was just there, and you just felt it without it really being talked about so much. Because there was, as a child, I think there was also like, this, we can't really talk about it in front of the children because it's just, too horrible. And I think like later, growing up in adulthood, I just realized more and more through a lot of conversations I had with my mother. I think it was also a process for her. I think the family was their own support group, talking, and even until today, family members, my mother and sisters, cousins, them already being grandparents, talking about, oh, do you remember like back then when we grew up? So they're still realizing things today, like how much the trauma has affected their childhood, how much the trauma is still affecting them today.
So you're saying it's still a work in progress, essentially? That realization of trauma is something that has been evolving?
Yeah. Well, in my personal experience, I think it had to do a lot with my mother's work, because my mother has started like in the mid-'80s to be part of the movement, political movement of Roma and Sinti in Germany. So she contributed a lot of time of her life to this work. And has been part of that movement, has worked with that subject to make it visible. And I think because she like really intensively dealt with the subject, so the subject was really there, it was present, and of course it was re-traumatizing for her, more than maybe for other family members who hasn't worked in that field. And I think If we look at the situation in Germany and the history of Roma and Sinti and the German history, we can see that the situation, that a trauma has happened and it's still very invisible. So this process is actually still very new, it's still very young, and it's still very unknown.
Do you feel that having a word for it, calling it collective transgenerational trauma, does that help?
Yeah, I think it really helps because, I mean, that word really explains what it is. And it also, transgenerational also tells us that, yes, it has happened many decades ago, but at the same time, it's still present for us today in some kind of way. And I think it's important also to have a term to make it somehow speakable and to also talk about it, in public.
Are you concerned with the next generation? Are you worried about passing it on as a mother?
Yeah, definitely. I think becoming a parent also made me reflect about it like in a totally different way, I think, because the whole time you're just thinking about yourself. That's how we are. That's how people are. You just worry about yourself. All of a sudden, you have to think about somebody else's life and you want, to do the best. Like, we all know the saying, like, I want my child to have it better than myself, right? So this is what most of the parents' goal is somehow. Yeah, I think I also worried about like passing on the trauma, and I'm trying like actively to work against that. And I think it works to a certain point because there's always something that you do and you don't realize that you do it, right?
How does the passing of trauma manifest itself?
Like being worried. This has like a really big impact on children, I think, because it's like it's a certain drive. If it's like one person being worried, classically the grandparent, but if it's like several people of the family being worried, this can really have an impact. And a child, you teach them to adapt to this kind of behavior and they will definitely adapt to it. So what I'm trying to do somehow is like if a situation like that happens, I talk a lot especially with my older child. Yeah, she can already understand it more than the younger one. And I try to talk with her. Is there maybe another way, or is it really necessary, or do we have to do it, or you know what? Maybe we're just going to do it different, like trying to go against it and trying to be like more like rational about it to make it understandable for the child and to give like also another option of behavior.
So it's about the fear not controlling the situation, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I'm just trying to give other options somehow. So she has another experience, I think one that I probably didn't have, because back then, at that point when I was a child, I think nobody of our family actually realized what's going on concerning trauma.
How did that fear affect you?
There were like many like limits that I had set for myself growing up, and also already being like an adult. There were like certain things where I just limited myself, to be more careful in certain things.
Like what?
Like traveling, like being like further away from family, going somewhere on my own. I just had to be more bold if I wanted like myself or my life to be like more developed. Or I could actually also say that I have dealt with like panic attacks for many years of my life, and I didn't really know why until I realized, also through talking, with my mother, looking through the history and everything. So I was like, okay, this is not really good life if you're dealing with panic attacks like every week or something. It's really draining and it's really uncomfortable and it limits your whole life. So I try to deal with it and I try to work on it also with professional help, with like a self-taught therapy system. And then interestingly, talking about it, other families were like, oh wow, I think I also have that. And I was like, really? Okay, here's the book. Please take it and read it. This helped me, might help you too. And it sure did. You have to be aware what's going on. For instance, why I have panic attacks. Why do I have panic attacks? Where is it rooted in? What am I actually afraid of? And that's probably the first step.
You were describing having to be braver. Could you explain in more detail what you mean by that?
Yeah, definitely. I use social media a lot nowadays, and I keep reading about this term, like breaking the generational trauma or breaking the generational boundaries. And there are like really cool videos and content with that term out there. And every time I read it, I'm thinking like, yeah, that's me somehow, because maybe it was not only me, maybe it was already my mother going down that path, but even more for myself nowadays, because I just, back then when I was still dealing a lot with panic attacks, I don't have that today anymore, but back then when I still had it, it would limit me. Like, can I really go to university in another city all by myself? Is that gonna trigger certain points and somehow find supportive systems or things that would help me to say, okay, I have these things that help me that I can use like as tools, and I have to do this because if I want to reach a certain goal, or if I want this or that in my life, for instance, and I want to get an apartment by myself and live by myself, which was really a big thing because I was the first younger female of our family, my mother's family, who decided to move into an apartment all by myself, even though I'm not married. But I knew I have to do this if I want to develop, if I want to become the person that I think I'm supposed to become. I have to go down this path, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel the difference between your grandparents' generation, your parents' generation, and your generation? And if so, can you tell us how?
For the second generation, that would be my mother's generation, if I listen to the stories, how they grew up and how their parents dealt with it, it was just totally different from what I have experienced. Because for them growing up as children, in the beginning, the parents didn't want to talk about the trauma, didn't want to talk about the experience and all the cruelty that they had to go through. But the funny thing was the children knew everything. They heard everything. Like back then, for my grandparents' generation, being in Germany, the German government or the German didn't even accept them as Holocaust survivors, that they were actually, in the concentration camps because they were Roma or Sinti. So this took 30 years after the end of the Second World War. So they were dealing with totally different situation back then. They didn't have any support system, therapies that are, specialized on these issues of trauma of the second or third generation. It doesn't exist in Germany. So this is actually where we're standing right now. I'm very sure it will exist because the community made sure and fought for it. Every kind of positive development is actually rooted in the political activism of the Roma and Sinti community. So I'm sure if that will exist one day, some kind of a psychological, support system, dealing with trauma and everything, it will definitely be rooted there. Yeah. But, so back to the question, I think my mother's generation, they didn't really talk about it. And the survivors, they were totally hurt. But they were trying to talk about it when they were gatherings, some kind of celebrations or events where different family members would meet. They would use this time to talk about it and to deal with actually their problems. And the children, they thought the children don't hear it and they're playing or whatever, but the children were next door, leaning to the door, trying to hear everything. And they thought that the children don't hear anything, but as for my family, the children heard everything. And then later, I think there was a phase where they didn't talk about it at all. And then my mother started with the political work. She started, being part of Roma and Sinti organization, trying to deal with the history and everything. So because of this fact, my mother dealing with our story, that has activated something. And of course, she had questions, or she also needed some insight. So there were a lot of conversations that my mother had, especially with her father, with my grandfather. And I think through that, the subject had come up again, like 30 years later or something. It was different because now it was in a more like somehow maybe more empowering way, because my mother was part of a movement and she was dealing with our history and she was trying to make it visible and creating material and stuff like that. So, okay, now it's our time. Now we're like, taking this in our hands and, trying to do something that will somehow, have a positive effect or help or support us in some kind of way. And my mother also wrote a book about it in German, though. It's called Vater Unser, eine Sinti-Familie erzählt. So that's translated would be like Our Father, Narratives of a Sinti Family. And and she's actually telling the story, our family story, but focused on the life of her father, of my grandfather, and the things that he had to go through. And then if I look at like my generation now and my mother's generation, I can see that there's like a big shift again. Like my mother's generation, they had to deal with the Holocaust and everything. If it wasn't for my mother and many other people doing that political work, many things wouldn't have been achieved by now. Because like the German government, the German country as a whole was not interested in dealing with the Roma and Sinti history, which was also or is part of the German history. They were not really interested. So they didn't put like scientists, teams or study groups together to see, okay, what has happened? Let's, work with this history. They didn't do that. It was people out of the community themselves. They went to the archives, like Ilona Lagreen, for instance, told me in an interview I had with her once that she had to go to the archive and really dig deep in all the documents to find out what happened. And she called the archives first. This is also like the 80s, 90s, and asked them, do you have documents about this family, that family? And they always told her and others, no, we don't have it. So they went there themselves, literally going through the documents, trying, to put the stories together. And there were I often heard stories of people going through the documents, doing that research, and all of a sudden they found documents of family members, relatives. And then they also had to really deal with the reparations. They were actually, like my mother's generation, they were fighting a lot for the right of the reparations for their parents' generation, so to say. Many didn't get anything. Some did a little bit. These were the subjects or the things that they had to deal with. And if I look at it like today, and the work that I'm doing and that we're doing at Roma and Pen and other self-organizations are doing, of course, today we are in a different position. And fortunately, we can create, like I mentioned before, content that will, give knowledge, give insight, material that you can work with. We are at a point of time where we can also create empowering content that will, have positive effects on our generation and also definitely on the younger generation.
How would visibility of the trauma of the Roma and Sinti community in Germany look like?
It would be a big shift if the trauma would be seen. And right now, to be honest, I can't really imagine that. Because I know how the situation in Germany is today, and I know that there's still a lot of really weird racist ideas when it comes to Roma and Sinti. Also the lack of knowledge, the lack of the history that it's still not really out there. And I say this very often, talking, in interviews kind of like this one, that I really think that there has to be a big difference and an update when it comes to the German school system. since I've been working with students a lot in the past, I know that this subject is not really mentioned in school. So I think this would be like the first step, to make a difference, because of course it would be necessary to make the trauma visible. But first, our whole history and our existence has to be made visible before that. Because how are the people able to understand trauma if they don't understand our history, which is part of their history?
Could you share some more details?
Yeah. So this means that Roma and Sinti are living in Germany since about 600 years. 600 years. That's a very long time. White German people can't even go back in their family history for 300 years, or not, let alone 600 years, right? So, and back then Germany didn't even exist as the country as that it is today. So this is the fact. And knowing that, like my ancestors have been living in this country for around 600 years, and we're still not seen as being part of the society. So this is a really big problem. People are still, and not only Roma and Sinti, of course, also other people of color, but we're talking about our community right now. So besides that, of course, there are also Roma and Sinti, or most of the time Romani people that have come to Germany as refugees. There are people that came to Germany whose family grandparents actually came to Germany back then as so-called contract workers. And most of these people not really seen as Romani people. They are seen as people from ex-Yugoslavia, as Serbian, Croatian people, maybe even Turkish people, Spanish people, and so on. But there are also Romani people amongst these back then contract workers from the 60s. So we have to look at the history as a whole, and we really have to go back not only a few decades. And this is what I mean when I'm talking about we are not visible, right? People if they see Romani people, they see them really in a negative way, not as their neighbors, schoolmates, colleagues, even though they are. Sinti and Roma are part of the German history. We contributed to this country. Our ancestors have even been soldiers in the First World War. So how more German do you want to get, But, there's this idea of in Germany, that German means white and mostly blonde. This is actually what the picture, that a lot of people who belong to the majority of the dominant society have that they have. The thing is that if you walk down the street here in Berlin, or maybe in Munich, or in another German city, you will realize that the German society does not equal a white person with blonde hair. This is not what it is today. And this is also even not what it was 30, 40 years ago. Also for me, talking as a Black person, because I also have African background, I know that this is also a big issue in the Black German community. They are not being seen as part of the society. These are all stories, biographies that are not told in school, and there should be a update in the school system. The whole history of Germany has to be taught when it comes to German history, because right now it's only fragments. So the whole history has to be taught, and also biographies. There are so many important biographies that the children and also the teachers can learn from. Making the people visible will automatically affect other subjects. For instance, when we talk about terms, what I mentioned earlier, like the racial term, or which term is the right term to be used. If we use the history in a respectful way, and we want to make it prepare it as a good learning content, how are we going to talk about it? Which terms are we going to use? Which content are we going to use? Where are we going to get the content from? Are we going to go to archives? So making everything visible would change or should change things. And this would really be a condition later then deal with trauma. And also another subject, if I think about dealing with trauma, is thoughts that I've heard a lot in the Black community and also in other communities of color when it comes to therapy. people of color oftentimes worried to use therapy, to use this kind of support, because they don't really know, am I going to face some kind of prejudice? Am I going to be confronted with some kind of racist thoughts or comment when I'm going there? Because I'm actually going there because I need support and don't want to be like in a situation where a therapist just makes a like racist comment or asks a stupid question, and I'm actually there because I'm looking for a trustful environment where I can get professional help.
What is your personal goal? Being seen, healing, all of the above. What is it that you really wish for?
Well, if I could like wish for and without all the concerns, of course, I would wish for an environment, a society without any form of discrimination. I'm trying to somehow contribute to that, like, let's call it dream right now, by producing like content that maybe like my children and the younger generation can work with, and that empowers them, and that is like definitely positive in a way. That's, for instance, why I also published a children's book last year. And it's actually the first, as far as I know, German children book that with Roma and Sinti characters who are also like the heroines of the story. When I have readings with that book, and for school classes, and there are maybe like, you know, students of like 2nd, 3rd, 4th graders sitting there, and they're really excited about it. They're excited about seeing the illustrations of the book because they can identify, and they're like, oh, look, this looks like me. Oh, look, she has the same hairstyle as you, or something like that. And they're really excited about it because it's something that they don't see a lot, right? They are constantly confronted with other pictures in children's books, movies, toys. But we know that children need these pictures to identify with, to give them a feeling that they belong, and also to show the reality. And the reality is a diverse society. There are situations like racist incidents, attacks, and my daughter's 10 now, she'll soon be 11. And of course, she also hears and realizes what's going on, right? It's like, okay, wow, my life could be in danger, you know? And they think about stuff like the murder of George Floyd has, you know, had a really big impact in Germany. It's interesting because it's always easier to deal with a subject if it's like outside of your country, even though we know that these things also happen here in Germany. And and then I had like for example, my daughter asking me, like, because she heard that there's like racist police violence, even where people have been murdered by German police, and she heard that in the news, and she was like, oh my God, is my life in danger? Am I actually protected by the police? Right? So this is something that we as parents have to deal with. So this is also my motivation, I think. And this is also why I think it's like highly important, you know, to work in that kind of field and to contribute something to it.
You're not just a writer, you're also a wonderful singer. And we're just going to listen to the song right now and then talk about it.
Menschen
Being an artist, for me, it's all about like sharing what I do, sharing my music, with the audience. So I do sing my songs in English, in German, and also in Romanes. And then also with the songs, for example, the one that you played, Chidaraf, means don't be afraid. And it actually talks about the persecution history of Romani people, of Sinti people. And it talks about like that we have dealt with a lot, but we're still here and we're still strong and we're taking it in our own hands. And, we're still standing strong, actually. That's what the song says. Who I am and where I'm coming from, like my family history is really part of my music as well. In one song, Zu viel Soul, too much soul. Yeah, that for a lot of people, it seems like it's too much, when they get to know me and who I am. And then, they're confronted with me being part of the Sinti community. I'm Sintezza. This connects to the history, what we have also talked about earlier. Then I'm also Afro-Sintezza. So there's like different layers of my identity that come together that sometimes seem to be too much, for certain people. And in that song, Too Much Soul, I'm saying like, okay, maybe it's not for you. Maybe there's too much soul for you. But you know what? Everybody has the right to be who they are. So here I am. And it's not a concept. It's just who I am.
Could there be also something positive about trauma?
That's an interesting question. I've never thought about this before. Yeah, maybe the positive thing about it could be what I have learned through it, or how, things like reflection, self-reflecting, improvement or something that I experienced through it for myself, but still don't really see a necessity for it to exist, to be honest, because there are also other challenges in life that can, help you develop and help you reflect yourself.
Do you also feel that trauma is always present in your life?
Yeah, totally. I definitely think that. And sometimes it's maybe louder and other times it might be lower. For myself, at least, I think there are different days or different phases, maybe, that you go through it somehow. Since this is something that is, like I said in the beginning, it's woven in our family history. It's woven in our families. This is like a highly personal experience. And I mean, we're part of it. It's not a decision, right? We're part of it because of what our ancestors have, or grandparents' generation had to go through. Sometimes people like to argue, like, I also face discrimination because I decided to join this and that group or something like this. That's a decision. You decided it, and if it's too much for you, or you change your mind or whatever, you're free to decide something else. But if this is like who you are, you can't really decide, today I don't really feel like dealing with that today. Maybe I'm just going to be white today. It's not going to work,
Tayo, how is it for you to hear about the news of the war in Ukraine, and how does it make you feel?
I wouldn't say that it has affected my personal life, but it has affected many Romani lives. A number of Romani people who tried to also flee from the Ukraine to Poland, to Germany or other countries, mostly to Poland. By doing that, by fleeing from the war, they were facing a lot of like racial discrimination. And me also being part of Romani Pen, we are not like focused on doing that kind of support work, but still in that emergency situation, we were also contacted by people. Like, I know somebody who's a Romani family, a Romani person, and they are stuck. Can you help? What can we do? It has had an effect like on me as far as like trying to be somehow helpful or supportive. We have a network, and I was able to contact them or try to bring people together. So there have been several incidents, where people don't get like the help like other refugees from the Ukraine did. Things like that I have heard of, experienced through other organizations.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
When it comes to the situation of Romani and Sinti people in Germany, there's like a lot of like false knowledge or missing knowledge, so to say, and all the situations that we're dealing with today of like invisibility, of everyday racism. I think there has been a lot of development the last 30, 40 years. And I think this development is really due to the power and the knowledge and the braveness of our community. Even though there's like so many and there are so many negative points that really always need to be mentioned, and I did mention a lot of them, I think, or many of them. At the same time, I'm still positive because through my work, I always make like really also a lot of positive experience. So I just had this idea and this dream. One day I'm going to publish this book for years. And so last year I did. And I just wanted it to be out there. So this was actually my goal. We don't have a book that displays, strong, positive Romani Sinti characters. Let's just produce it. The reaction is really like overwhelming. And I didn't really see that coming. And this is also something that like gives me hope, because I could see there are people in our society who realize that it's important to make these subjects visible. They realize that it's important for educational work, it's important for the children, it's important for us as society as a whole to talk about this and to give it like a platform and to give it space. So these people exist, and our children and their children, that's also something that's a really big motivation.
That's beautiful.
Thank you very much for having me. It's important to talk about this. I'm really thankful also for like solidarities within, our communities and like shared experience that we have. And I think this is really important for us, to connect. And it's really appreciated. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. This was Invisible Wound. If you liked what you heard, please consider donating to AMCHA. Your donation will go to supporting Holocaust survivors in need and their families. You will find more information in the link below. And don't forget to rate us on Spotify.